This is Democracy Watch. We've got breaking news here. With a firm that you used to work for, that's Perkins Coie, a ruling was just handed down in court. Can you explain what just happened?
Yeah, a federal district judge in Washington, D.C. just permanently blocked the Trump administration's executive order targeting my former law firm, as you mentioned, Perkins Coie. This was the first law firm that Donald Trump went after with one of these executive orders that, tried to ban their employees from government buildings, prohibit them from having government contracts, revoke security clearances. You remember there was a whole list of things. And it was largely premised on the fact that I had been a partner there. And when I was a partner there, I had represented Hillary Clinton's campaign in 2016, and I had represented President Biden successfully after the 2020 election in 60 plus cases, beating back 60 plus cases that Donald Trump and his allies had brought to try to overturn the outcome of the 2020 election. I have to say, Brian, it is good to see the federal courts acting quickly here. The judge had a lot to say, not just about how wrong-minded it is and terrible and unconstitutional what the Trump administration did, but in the judge's own way, she made clear that the law firms that have capitulated, that have not stood up, have done real damage to the judicial and legal system.
So you had mentioned that this is Judge Howell here in the DC court system. You'd mentioned that she permanently blocked this executive order from going through. So does that mean that the Trump administration doesn't have the option to appeal?
Well, no, they can appeal this, but what it means that in the meantime, they cannot give any effect to this executive order. Okay. It is blocked in all of its parts. And the reason why that is important is there were, I think it was widely understood that there were parts of this that were definitely going to get blocked. The parts, for example, about the entering government buildings, that's ridiculous. And then there were a few parts that I think people had a question about. One was the revocation of security clearances, because security clearances are usually up to the president. There's no right to have access to, classified information. And if the president wants to revoke it, there's a lot of case law that says that he gets to do that. The judge blocked that. The judge also blocked Section 1 of the executive order, which was essentially the findings, the screed, shall we call it, which again, I think the government would say, well, that was just like, venting. And it shouldn't be blocked. But she said, no, actually, that also gets blocked. So she blocked it literally from the first word to the last piece of punctuation in the executive order. So the Trump administration, Donald Trump, can appeal this to the DC Circuit. But in the meantime, this executive order is null and void in its entirety. And that is good news for democracy.
Mark, does this set some type of atmospheric precedent where now that this ruling has been handed down, now that Judge Howell has done her due diligence and handed down her ruling, that it impacts in some kind of way the appeals court when they look at this?
Look, I think it affects not just the appeals court. I think it affects, remember, there are cases that other law firms have been bringing,
right,
that where they have been similarly subject to these unconstitutional executive orders. I think this helps them in their cases. And I also think this is a real signal to the legal community as a whole that there are the good guys and the bad guys. Now, Donald Trump and the administration, ultimate villain, they're the one who issued this executive order. But the judge notes in a footnote that, there are the law firms that have stood up, including Williams and Connolly, which is the law firm representing Perkins Coie, and there are the law firms that have hidden, the law firms that have capitulated, and that this may have some atmospheric impacts not only on the courts and what the Court of Appeals does, what other judges do, but hopefully it'll also have an atmospheric impact on what the legal establishment does.
Is that unorthodox for a judge to look at the other kind of tertiary players in this space and kind of opine on their situation, which of course is analogous to this, but still they're not parties to this particular case. Only Perkins Coie is.
Look, I think that it is hard for any judge. It is hard for any lawyer. Frankly, it should be hard for any citizen to not feel compelled to draw a comparison, to draw a distinction between the law firms that are fighting and the law firms that are collaborating, between the universities that are fighting and the universities that are capitulating, between the media organizations like yours and democracy dockets that are standing up in the face of the Trump administration, and the large corporate legacy media outlets that are cutting deals and shoveling millions and tens of millions
Yeah.
of dollars into the pocket. So, I mean, the judge drew a distinction in the legal field, but Brian, I think that that is a distinction that we are seeing necessarily drawn across the board, across industries.
I have to ask, in light of this ruling, for your opinion as well. Like, how do you think that the Paul Weisses of the world feel after looking at this, after looking at Perkins Coie take a stand? And by the way, they've got 600 law firms who have signed an amicus brief defending their actions, defending their right to stand up in the face of this clearly unconstitutional and illegal executive order. How do you think that they feel knowing that they were the ones that not only capitulated themselves, but gave Trump a permission structure to think to himself, okay, you know what? This is actually easier than I thought. Now that I own Paul Weiss, I'm going to go after 5 more. I'm going to go after 10 more. I'm going to go after 20 more.
Yeah, and by the way, the judge noted the amicus brief you are referring to, which I thought was actually quite telling, because she made basically the point you just made. Look at all of these law firms that have signed on to the brief and other briefs like them, and then look at the law firms that have either settled or stayed quiet. So I think that is, it is hard not to notice that, and I am
Yeah.
sure that for the lawyers at Paul Weiss, they have to feel that. I mean, if you're a rank and file associate at Paul Weiss, you have to be ashamed of your law firm. If you're a rank and file partner at Paul Weiss, you have to, hang your head in shame. And if you're in the leadership of Paul Weiss, history will remember you for the cowards that you are. You will make a few extra dollars now. You will become a multimillionaire times a few more. But your children and your grandchildren will always have to know and will always explain to others why it was that you, when faced with authoritarianism, when democracy was in crisis, why you chose those few extra dollars over principles, over the legal profession, and over democracy itself.
That's perfectly put. Mark, I have to ask, I think from the outside, a lot of us kind of view this whole space pretty cynically, or at least I can speak for myself, view this space pretty cynically. But does it really have an impact that certain law firms are opting to capitulate versus certain law firms are willing to stand up when it comes to the clientele, for example? Or is it just this very Succession-esque space where it's all about just money and who they think can win them their case, and really nothing else is a consideration?
No, look, I think it matters in a few ways. I think number one, if the powerful are not willing to stand up against authoritarianism, it is that much harder to ask other peoples to. Number one. Number two, I think that it does matter to clients. I think that we are in a world in which people are having to choose sides. There was just a report recently that Microsoft might have pulled some work from one of the firms that capitulated and given it to Jenner and Block, which was one of the firms that was targeted. So it's going to eventually touch all aspects of the legal profession. But the third thing is, and this is something you and I have talked about, that really affects everyday Americans. So it affects everyone watching this video, which is that, Donald Trump has collected nearly $1 billion worth of free legal services from some of the top law firms in the country, some of the most sophisticated lawyers in the country, who have some of the best, most talented associates working for them in the country. We do not need a world right now in which Donald Trump is able to supplement all of the terrible things that he is doing with that kind of legal talent. And that will only mean worse things, worse outcomes for everyday Americans. Plus, you have a lot of worthy nonprofit organizations, a lot of worthy causes right now that may not get access to lawyers at all. Immigrants who may not get access to lawyers, disfavored nonprofit organizations, or things that Donald Trump may rail against, diversity initiatives. They may not be able to find lawyers at all because these large law firms have capitulated. So, it's not just some inside game among lawyers. This has real world consequences for everyone.
Can you talk about how you feel in all of this? Because look, you were, first of all, very likely the reason that Trump targeted Perkins Coie to begin with, in that this was your law firm prior to ELG, which is your current law firm. And also, he's called you out by name at the Department of Justice, which with a big wink and a nod to all of those prosecutors sitting there in attendance. And so, in light of this major victory at the hands of Judge Howell, and in favor of Perkins Coie, how does this impact you, and how does this impact your outlook and your response more broadly to what we're seeing?
Yeah, so I have to say, part of the reason, for those of you out there who don't know, I told Brian I needed a few minutes before we recorded this because I needed to read the opinion and digest it. And part of digesting it is not just understanding what it says about the law, but part of it is reading about what it says about the facts. And I am mentioned throughout this opinion for exactly the reasons you say. And, and it retells the story of the years of abuse and attack that Donald Trump has heaped on me and on others, but me specifically. They unearth things that, frankly, if I ever knew that he did, I don't remember, and other things that I remember now that I see it in writing, like him calling me the best election stealing lawyer in 2018. I now actually remember him saying that. But for example, in March of 2024, he posted an article on Truth Social entitled "Mark Elias is Scared and He Should Be." I can't say I was familiar with that. I don't remember being familiar with it. I don't read Truth Social, but this is the president of the United States. This is someone who right now is weaponizing government against his political opponents. And you mentioned his recent speech at the Department of Justice in which he singled me out. He has mentioned me in this executive order that was just struck down. He mentioned me in another executive order that has not yet been challenged. But he also has, been obsessed over time with the work that I've done to thwart him and the work I've done to stand up for free and fair elections. And so reading the opinion, I am both relieved, I am gratified, I am strengthened by this, but I have to also say it is causing me to reflect on just how long it has been that Donald Trump has been after me. And so that's not going to stop me from fighting. It's not going to stop me from continuing on. But boy, it has been a long journey.
Well, Mark, I've got two things here. First, we've done officially 300 episodes of Democracy Watch, so I want to thank you for all of the knowledge and wisdom that you've been able to impart. But I also want to bring up the fact that, in this era, I think the one thing that we're looking for above everything else is the fighters, and nobody exemplifies that spirit more than you and your team. I mean, you are there on the front lines, fighting in the trenches, in places, to your exact point, that I think 99.999% of Americans wouldn't have the stomach to go in on a daily basis. I mean, it's no small thing. I know that we kind of become inured to this stuff because we see it so often, and the Overton window shifts, and all of it becomes normalized. The lunacy becomes normalized. But to have the president of the United States call you out is one thing. To have him call you out at the Department of Justice in front of all of these prosecutors and people who would be able to wield their power and the power of the federal government against you specifically is something that I think would just send everybody else into a tailspin over. The fact that you have been able to do this, to do it so effectively and to do it with so much class and grace, I think is a testament to the fact that the fight you're fighting is virtuous, and I know I speak for everybody who's watching this right now in thanking you for being there on the front lines and doing what so many of us are hoping that we would have people do, and that is actually pushing back and fighting for our democracy. So on behalf of everybody watching, and after 300 episodes of this series, just wanted to say thank you and to give you some motivation and inspiration to keep fighting here as we go deeper and deeper into this administration.
Yeah, and I want to thank you. I mean, the fact is these 300 episodes have really helped me personally. I mean, your audience is amazing. I mean, I got to tell you, you have the most dedicated fans. The people who watch you and learn from you are fortunate to have you, but they give back in a lot of different ways. And so I have been able to gain a voice that I would not have if not for the series that we've done. I've learned an enormous amount from you, both about how to communicate, but also on the substance of what is going on. You have offered me perspective that has been incredibly helpful, both as a lawyer, but also as someone trying to influence and explain myself to others. So thank you for that. I will excuse the fact that there's no cake for the third 300th episode. Number 400, we're going to have a cake.
That's right. That's right. For those who are watching right now, it is true that I did promise Mark a cake, and didn't anticipate this Perkins-Coie ruling happening so quickly. So there is in fact no cake, but I promise you will get a double cake for 400 now. And to Mark's point, I do want to reiterate, thank you for everybody who's watching. You all watching is really what makes this series a success. So with that said, please, if you want to support the invaluable work that Mark is doing and his team are doing on the front lines of this thing, please sign up for Democracy Docket, a small step that we can all take to support his invaluable work. I'll put the link right here on the screen and also in the post description of this video. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
I'm Mark Elias.
This is Democracy Watch.